Can you have too much articulation? On full-scale vehicles, it can be challenging to get a high degree of articulation front to rear because of all the constraints. But on an RC crawler, it's a lot easier and you can overdo it. Here's how I learned how much is too much. Just so we are on the same page, articulation is usually defined as how high you can lift one wheel while keeping all three other wheels on the ground. You can measure it by height, or you can measure by angle. Personally, I like to look at the angle because I think it's a better apples-to-apples comparison between vehicles, but it doesn't really tell you how big of an obstacle you can surmount. On the very first custom crawler I built, I ran 80 to 90% droop, and my logic was that it didn't matter how low the wheels dropped. I thought the more they dropped, the better, because I could maintain wheel contact and traction over taller, high-centering events. The flaw in my logic was that with a lot of negative travel, you also get a lot of articulation. I had over 80 degrees easily, and I was happy with that at the time, until I kept getting stuck and bound up in situations like this. So I started shortening my shocks. I have custom assembled shocks with 19 millimeters of stroke, front and rear, which is just by coincidence because I designed by the movement, not by the exact shock numbers, and they just happen to end up at 19 each. That's right in the middle of DravTech short and ultra short shock strokes. One way that people like to talk about articulation is by tire size. You'll often hear people say 1 to 1.5 diameters worth of articulation is a good range. On this car, you can see the articulation is right about when the back wheel starts to lift up. That's going to be full articulation. And I've got about 1.25 wheel diameters. This is about where I like it. We can also measure by angle. I'm lining this up by my eye. It might not be lined up with the camera exactly, but I'm going to call that about 54 degrees. When you're at full articulation, you should have one shock completely extended and the opposite one completely compressed. And it will be the opposite in the front. Another thing that's real important is to make sure you're not getting any binding in your articulation. And it's best to do that with the shocks disconnected, but you want to make sure that it will swing completely freely through the full range of the shocks. You want to make sure your links aren't hitting your links and your links aren't hitting your drive shaft. Both are very common occurrences. You also want to make sure that your links aren't binding where they attach to either the chassis or the frame. In this case, I had to use an offset rod end in order to get full articulation in the upward direction. Otherwise, it would hit. So make sure that your rod ends have full clearance. You may have to use offset or angled rod ends to be sure you've got that full travel and that full articulation. Here's what it looks like on the rocks. Watch how that right rear just floats over the gap and gently touches down on the other side. It's almost like levitation. Now let's watch it back in slow motion. With any more articulation, that right rear would sink into the chasm and could be impossible to climb out. All right, that was still full speed. Crawlers just always look like slow motion. So what did we learn? You can have too much articulation. It's better to float than sink. 50 to 60 degrees is a sweet spot that I like. And be sure your links aren't binding. Now go get twisted.